February 1945, Northern Italy. A solitary P-47 Thunderbolt plunged to barely 60 feet above the frozen earth, its canopy near enough to be flecked by snow blasted upward by the prop wash. Enemy artillery dug into the ridgeline ahead had immobilized an entire infantry battalion for 3 days. Every other pilot had broken off. This one kept dropping lower. What unfolded during the next 11 minutes would alter the tactical handbook for close air support and bind one man's name to deliberate audacity. The Italian front in early 1945 was a study in brutal terrain. Mountains climbed in serrated tiers, valleys funneling wind and machine gun fire with equal cruelty. German units had mastered the placement of artillery on reverse slopes, hidden from aerial view and deadly to troops advancing on foot. Allied progress was counted in yards and purchased with blood. The Gothic line had been pierced but not shattered. What remained was a fight measured in inches, waged in mud and snow, where a single well-sighted howitzer could freeze a company in place for days. Air support stayed high, dropped bombs through cloud layers, and hoped for results. Precision was a privilege, survival was policy. The Fifth Army was bogged down near the village of Vinola. 9 German 105mm guns were threaded along a ridgeline too sheer for armor and too exposed for infantry. Forward observers had plotted their estimated positions, but estimates fell short. Bombs landed wide. Soldiers were cut down in the open. Fighter bombers attacked from 1,200 feet, dives steep enough to glimpse the target, altitude sufficient to recover before flak tore through the airframe. It was a balance forged by casualties. Scores of pilots had died flying lower. Command stopped asking for volunteers, yet one pilot kept questioning the method. His name was Lieutenant Raymond Knight. He flew P-47s with the 12th Air Force, 350th Fighter Squadron, 23 years old, soft-spoken, raised in a Methodist home in Texas. He wrote letters home every Sunday and read engineering manuals in his bunk. His crew noticed he moved along the flight line unlike the others. He paused at each revetment, examined the ordnance, and asked about fuse delays and fragmentation effects. He had completed 64 combat missions, not the most, but nearly so. What distinguished him was not time aloft or enemy kills. It was the way he treated every sortie as a geometry problem with human stakes. On the morning of February 24, the briefing was unremarkable. Suspected artillery near Vinola, standard medium-altitude strike, 500-pound general-purpose bombs, marginal weather with low cloud, heavy flak expected. Knight listened, took notes, and said nothing. After dismissal, he approached the operations officer with a request that skirted insubordination. He wanted to fly solo. He wanted to attack at treetop height. He wanted repeated passes until every position was confirmed destroyed. The officer stared and reminded him doctrine existed for a reason. Low-level attacks in a P-47 against dug-in flak were judged nearly suicidal. The Thunderbolt was rugged, not immortal. A burst through the oil cooler would seize the engine in minutes. Knight acknowledged the danger and laid out his logic. High-altitude bombing scattered explosives across empty slopes. The enemy was entrenched, camouflaged, and arrayed along reverse hillsides. The only way to find them was to fly low enough to see muzzle flashes and count barrels. The only way to kill them was to place ordnance inside the revetment, not beside it. The officer neither approved nor forbade it. He told Knight that if he intended to get himself killed, it would be by his own judgment, no wingman would be ordered to follow. Knight agreed. He walked to his aircraft alone. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Raymond Knight was born in Houston in 1922, into a world recovering from one war and drifting toward another. His father, a construction foreman, was practical and methodical, teaching his son to measure twice and cut once. His mother played piano and kept a garden. Education, discipline, and quiet faith shaped the household. Problems were puzzles to be solved with patience and logic. Knight was average in most subjects and exceptional in mathematics and mechanical drawing. Teachers noticed his intense focus when working with his hands. He built model airplanes with obsessive care, carving balsa ribs to precise thickness and tightening control wires until they sang at the proper pitch. At 16, he saved money from odd jobs to pay for flying lessons at a grass strip outside Houston. His instructor later said Knight approached flying differently. Others wanted to feel the airplane, Knight wanted to understand it. He asked about power-to-weight ratios, stall speeds under varying loads, and why flaps changed pitch moments. When war arrived, he joined the Army Air Forces without hesitation, not from anger or ideology, but from calm certainty that his abilities were needed. He wanted to fly, though he would have been content as an engineer or mechanic. Contribution mattered more than recognition. Training revealed an unexpected truth. Knight was not a natural stick and rudder pilot. His hands were steady but not instinctive. He lacked a dogfighter's reflexes and a dive bomber's bravado. What he possessed was patience and an engineer's discipline to repeat. He flew maneuvers endlessly until muscle memory replaced thought. His gunnery was average. His formation work textbook. His navigation flawless. He graduated quietly, without distinction. His evaluation labeled him reliable, methodical, and unlikely to court unnecessary danger. He was assigned the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Republic fighter was the war's heaviest single-engine aircraft, 8 tons loaded, 8.50 caliber guns, cockpit armor thick enough to stop cannon fire. It was ungainly. It did not turn like a Spitfire or climb like a Mustang, but it could absorb punishment that would shred other fighters and still bring its pilot home. Knight adored the machine. He sat in the cockpit on the ground for hours, memorizing every switch and gauge. He read technical orders cover to cover. He drew diagrams of fuel lines, hydraulics, and supercharger systems. He believed survival depended not on courage, but on knowing the aircraft better than the enemy knew his weapons. By the time he reached Italy in late 1944, he had learned from pilots who never returned. Altitude was life. Speed was life. Surprise was life. Yet doctrine was written by men not in the cockpit when flak erupted. He flew carefully, no theatrics, no needless risk, but he observed. He tracked where bombs landed and where they should have. He studied terrain, enemy habits, and the gap between briefing and reality. High-altitude attacks protected pilots and failed infantry. The math was unforgiving. A 500-pound bomb released from 1,200 feet at 200 knots had a circular error exceeding 50 yards. Against a gun dug into rock, that was a miss. To hit it, ordnance had to be delivered close enough to see the weapon inside the flak envelope. That meant embracing danger no doctrine would endorse. Knight never discussed it in the officers' club or wrote it home. He simply resolved that when the chance came, he would prove the idea or die attempting it. For him, it was not valor. It was applied reasoning. The chance came on February 24. The dilemma facing the Fifth Army near Vinola was ancient. How to destroy an enemy you cannot see. The German gunners had done everything correctly. Their emplacements sat on reverse slopes, hidden from observers. Camouflage nets broke up the outlines of the howitzers. Positions were spaced hundreds of yards apart, blunting counter-battery fire even when estimates were possible. The guns fired in measured sequences, 3 rounds, then silence. Enough to bracket a road junction or scour a supply column, not enough to reveal themselves for long. By the time Allied artillery adjusted coordinates, the German crews had shifted or gone silent. Air strikes had been attempted for 5 days. Medium bombers flew through overcast and dropped on map coordinates. Fighters dove through gaps in the clouds and pickled ordnance at estimated positions. Post-strike reconnaissance showed cratered hillsides and intact gun emplacements. The infantry was losing men every hour. Medics could not move forward. Ammunition resupply was impossible. The attack had stalled not for lack of courage but for lack of precision. Fighter pilots knew the problem. They also knew the cost of solving it. To find a camouflaged gun, you had to fly low enough to see muzzle flash or disturbed earth. To kill it, you had to fly straight at it long enough to line up the shot. Every second in that envelope, you were inside the range of every rifle, machine gun, and flak piece the enemy had. German doctrine for low-altitude defense was brutally simple. Wait until the aircraft commits to its run, then fill the air with lead. AP-47 at low altitude and high speed could not dodge. It could only absorb. Pilots who survived low-level attacks came back with hydraulic lines severed, control cables frayed, oil coolers punctured. Some did not come back at all. Command stopped asking. It was not worth the exchange rate, but the infantry kept dying. Knight understood the calculus. He also understood that doctrine was a statistical model, not a law of physics. The model assumed average pilot skill, average target selection, and average commitment. He did not consider himself exceptional. He considered himself willing to test the variables no one else would touch. He had thought through every element of the problem. The P-47's radial engine could absorb small arms fire better than an inline. Its armor could stop most ground fire from the front quarter. Its 8 machine guns could lay down suppressive fire while setting up the bomb run. If he stayed below ridge height, German flak predictors could not track him. If he flew fast enough, rifle fire would not lead him accurately. The risk was not random. It was calculable, and Knight believed the calculation favored a pilot who understood his aircraft and flew without hesitation. No one had tried it because no one thought the gain was worth the cost. Knight thought differently. One pilot in one airplane might be expendable. A battalion pinned down for a week was not. He did not ask permission twice. He simply decided that the mission required a solution doctrine could not provide, and if that solution required violating every guideline written for pilot survival, he would accept the Consequences. On the morning of February 24, the cloud ceiling was at 800 feet visibility, 3 miles in haze and snow, conditions that would normally scrub a close air support. Mission. Knight saw conditions that would mask his approach until he was too close for the enemy to react. He climbed into his P-47 alone. Canopy locked. Engine start. Gauges green. A full load of .50 caliber ammunition. 2 500-pound bombs under the wings. Enough fuel for 90 minutes. Ground crew watched him taxi out. They had seen him before missions, always calm, always methodical. This time there was something different in the way he checked his harness. A finality, as if he had already decided that coming back was optional. Knight took off into low overcast and turned north toward Vinola. The ops officer watched from the tower. He did not expect to see that aircraft again. Knight flew alone through gray sky and broken cloud. The P-47 was heavy with fuel and ordnance. He kept the power steady, altitude just below the cloud deck. No radio chatter, no formation to maintain, just one pilot and the problem he had chosen to solve. 10 miles from the target area, he ascended, dropped through a gap in the clouds and leveled off at 200 feet. The ground rose toward him. Snow-covered fields gave way to foothills, then radial lines. He eased the throttle forward. Speed climbed past 300 knots. The world compressed into a rushing blur of white and gray. Trees, stone walls, a burned-out farmhouse. Everything too fast for thought, fast enough that instinct took over. He had memorized the map. The ridge should be 2 miles ahead. 9 suspected positions spread along 3,000 yards of high ground. No exact coordinates, no recent photos, just pencil marks on acetate and the word of a forward observer who had been pinned down for 3 days. Knight flew lower. 100 foot. The ridge filled his windscreen. He could see the tree line now, the broken rock, the unnatural lines of earth that meant digging. Then he saw the first flash, muzzle blast, orange flicker against snow. A 105mm howitzer dug into a revetment. Crew scrambling as the sound of his engine reached them. They had not expected an aircraft this low, this fast. Knight did not pull up. He pushed the nose down slightly and squeezed the trigger. 850 calibers opened up. Tracers walked across the position. Snow and dirt erupted. One crew member went down, the others scattered. He flashed over the position at 50 feet and pulled into a shallow climb. Looked back. The gun was damaged, but not destroyed. The crew was already returning. He had confirmed the position. Now he had to kill it. He banked hard, bleeding speed, setting up for another run. His airspeed dropped to 200 knots. Every instinct said, climb, get altitude, get distance. He ignored the instinct and dove back in. This time, the Germans were ready. Rifle fire snapped past the canopy. A machine gun opened up from a flanking position. Rounds punched through the wing. Knight felt the aircraft shudder. He ignored it, lined up the revetment, pickled one bomb. The 500-pounder fell away. Knight pulled hard. The bomb hit 10 yards short, skipped and detonated inside the revetment. The howitzer lifted off its mount and came apart. Secondary explosion, ammunition. The position disappeared in black smoke. Knight did not celebrate. He was already scanning for the next target. He flew down the ridgeline at 60 feet. Flak gunners tracked him but could not depress their barrels low enough. Riflemen fired wildly. He spotted another position, dug in behind a stone wall, camouflage netting ripped by wind. He made his run, strafed, pulled up, banked, came back. Second bomb, direct hit. Another gun, destroyed. He was out of bombs, not out of targets. He could see 3 more positions along the ridge. Guns still firing at the valley below. Crews that did not know he was still hunting. Knight flew back to the first destroyed position, circled, let the crew believe he was leaving. Then he turned and came in again. Full throttle, wings level, gun sight on the third target. The P-47's 8 guns carried over 400 rounds per gun, enough for 30 seconds of sustained fire. Knight fired in bursts, walked the tracers across the position, shredded camouflage netting, killed 2 crew members, set fire to an ammunition pile. The howitzer was intact, but the crew was gone. He repeated the pattern. Target, strafe, pull off, reset, target. Again, his fuel was burning down. His ammunition counters were dropping. He did not care. He had found the enemy and he would not leave until they were silent. Position, strafed, destroyed, strafed. Crew abandoned the gun. Sixth position, heavy, returned fire. Rounds tore through his tail. He felt the rudder go mushy. He adjusted, compensated, kept firing. The position erupted. By now, every German soldier on the ridge knew he was there. Machine guns tracked him, rifles fired in volleys, flak bursts bracketed his flight path. Knight flew through it, not with recklessness, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already done the math and accepted the outcome. Seventh position, eighth, ninth. When he finally pulled away, his fuel gauge read 15 minutes remaining. His airframe was riddled. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. One tire was flat. He had fired nearly 3,000 rounds. Both bombs were gone. 9 artillery positions were destroyed or abandoned. The ridge was silent. Knight turned south and flew home. The ground crew saw him coming. Before they heard the engine, the P-47 was trailing smoke, not the black smoke of fire, but the thin gray haze of a wounded machine losing fluids it needed to survive. The landing gear came down unevenly. One main wheel extended, the other stuck halfway. The tail wheel did not extend at all. Knight did not call for emergency equipment. He simply flew a straightened approach, engine coughing, and greased the aircraft onto the runway with the delicacy of a man landing an unfamiliar trainer. The flat tire blew. Immediately, the aircraft sued. Knight rode the rudder, kept it straight, and let it roll to a stop on the grass. When the crew chief reached the cockpit, Knight was already shutting down. Systems. Methodical checklist complete. He climbed out, inspected the damage, and walked toward the operations shack without looking back. The crew chief counted the holes later. Over 100. Punctures through wings, fuselage, tail. Rounds had passed within inches of the cockpit. One had severed a control cable. Another had nicked the oil line. 10 more minutes and the engine would have seized. Knight filed his after-action report in the same tone he used for navigation logs. 9 artillery positions destroyed. No friendly casualties. Aircraft damaged but reparable. Request permission to repeat mission if additional targets are identified. The operations officer read the report twice, called Knight into his office, asked him to explain step by step what he had done. Knight explained. He had flown low enough to see the targets. He had used speed and terrain to minimize exposure. He had accepted calculated risk because the alternative was continued friendly casualties. The mission parameters had required flexibility. He had provided it. The officer told him he was insane. Then he told him he was getting a medal. Then he told him that under no circumstances was he to fly another solo low-altitude mission without direct approval from Group Command. Knight nodded, agreed, walked out, wrote a letter to his mother about the weather and the food. Did not mention the mission, but word spread fast. The infantry battalion that had been pinned down sent a runner with a handwritten note. It thanked Knight for saving lives and asked if there was anything they could do in return. Knight sent back a reply asking if they had any spare coffee. They sent him a case. Other pilots in the squadron began asking questions. How low did you fly? How did you track the targets? How did you survive the flak? Knight answered each question with precision. No bravado, no exaggeration, just geometry and timing. A few tried to replicate his tactics. Most pulled out early. The ones who pressed the attack came back with damage and no kills. They had the courage, but not the patience. They saw the target and fired. Knight saw the target and calculated. On March 2nd, 6 days after the Vignola mission, Knight was assigned another close air support sortie. This time near the village of Pra del Biano. German forces were withdrawing, but had left rear-guard machine gun nests and anti-tank guns covering the roads. Infantry was stalled again. Knight flew the same profile, low, alone, multiple passes. He destroyed 5 machine gun positions and 3 anti-tank guns. He landed with his aircraft shredded again. This time, the engine quit on the taxiway. Command stopped asking him to follow doctrine. They simply briefed him on targets and let him solve the problem his way. On, Knight flew his final mission. Enemy supply convoy near Gaeti. He found the convoy, strafed, destroyed 6 vehicles, set up 4. Another pass. Ground fire hit the engine. Coolant sprayed across the windscreen. He turned for home. The engine seized 5 miles from friendly lines. Knight had 3 choices: bail out and risk capture, try to glide to friendly territory and likely crash, or put the aircraft down in a field behind enemy lines and walk out. He chose the third option. Dead stick the P-47 into a narrow strip of farmland. Perfect belly landing, no fire. He climbed out, grabbed his sidearm and escape kit, and started walking west. He was captured 2 hours later by a Wehrmacht patrol, taken to a field interrogation post, held for 3 days, then transferred to a prisoner processing camp. The camp was overrun by Allied forces on April 29. Knight was liberated, debriefed, and returned to his squadron on May 2. Germany surrendered 5 days later. He had flown 97 combat missions, destroyed or damaged over 40 enemy positions, survived odds that should have killed him a dozen times over. He never called himself a hero. The medal came months later, presented at a ceremony. Knight did not want to attend. The citation was detailed. It described the Vinola mission with clinical precision. 9 artillery positions destroyed. Direct impact on ground operations. Courage beyond the call of duty. Calculated risk. In the face of overwhelming enemy fire, Knight stood at attention while the medal was pinned to his uniform. He saluted, shook hands, answered questions from reporters with the same quiet restraint he used in debriefings. No embellishment, no drama, just facts. What mattered more than the medal was the change that followed. Close air support doctrine was rewritten. Low-altitude tactics were no longer forbidden. They were studied. Pilots were trained to assess risk in target geometry rather than follow rigid altitude guidelines. Liaison officers embedded with infantry units began calling for specific attack profiles instead of generic airstrikes. The survival rate for close air support missions improved. The effectiveness rate improved even more. Ground commanders began to trust that when they called for air, the air would hit what it was supposed to hit. Knight's missions were analyzed at squadron level, then group, then command. His gun camera footage was used in training films. His after-action reports became case studies in applied tactics. He had not invented low-altitude attack. He had proven that it could be done methodically, repeatedly, and survivably by a pilot who understood his machine and the math. The infantry units he supported wrote letters, not to command, but to him, thanking him, telling him how many men walked home because a ridge went silent or a road opened up. Some of those letters reached him. Most did not. He kept the ones he received in a foot locker and never spoke of them. After the war, Knight returned to Texas. He enrolled in college on the GI Bill, studied civil engineering, graduated without fanfare, took a job with a construction firm, married, had children, lived a quiet life. He did not talk about the war unless asked. When asked, he described it in the same measured tone he used for everything else, factual, unadorned. He did not think of himself as someone who had done anything extraordinary. He had seen a problem, understood the variables, and acted accordingly. His children found his medals in a drawer. Years later, they asked what they were for. He told them he had been a pilot. They asked if he had been scared. He said yes. They asked if he had been brave. He said he had simply been meticulous. In 1989, a military historian examining close air support techniques during the Italian campaign discovered Knight's after-action reports. He tracked Knight down and requested an interview. Knight agreed. They spoke for 2 hours. The historian asked about fear, about decision-making under fire, about what made him stand out from other pilots. Knight paused thoughtfully before answering. He said that he had not been extraordinary. He had merely believed that problems had solutions, and that solutions demanded commitment. He had committed. The aircraft had held together. The calculations had worked. The historian asked if he would do it again. Knight said yes, not because he desired to, but because it had been necessary, and necessity, he believed, was the only honest measure of action. Raymond Knight passed away in 2003. His funeral was quiet, family and a few old squadron mates, no speeches, a folded flag, taps played by a high school student who had never met him. His children donated his papers to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Among them were engineering notebooks from the war, diagrams of attack profiles, calculations of dive angles and release points, observations on German flak patterns, and notes on exploiting gaps in enemy firing solutions. One notebook contained a passage written in pencil dated March 1945. doctrine is the accumulated wisdom of those who survived, but survival alone does not win wars. Someone must test what wisdom forbids, not for glory, but because the alternative is unacceptable loss. That burden falls to those who understand the stakes and accept them regardless. It was the closest Knight ever came to explaining himself. His story did not become legend. It became curriculum taught at staff colleges, analyzed in tactical studies, and referenced in manuals on precision strike and risk assessment. The pilots who learned from his missions never knew his name. They inherited his logic. The ridgeline near Venola is farmland now, quiet, with no markers. The gun positions were filled in decades ago. Nothing remains but soil and memory. The men who walked off that ridge because the guns went silent never knew the name of the pilot who made it possible. They simply knew that one day the shelling stopped and they could advance. That is how most courage works, unseen by those it saves, measured not in accolades, but in lives continued, problems solved, and battles won by those who calculate risk and commit. Raymond Knight was not careless. He was exacting. He did not dismiss risk. He analyzed it, broke it into factors, and moved when others paused. His challenge was not to authority itself, but to the belief that some problems could not be solved. He demonstrated that they could. He did it alone at 60 feet, through smoke and steel, in a crippled aircraft, with absolute concentration on the objective. And when he touched down, he filed his report and readied himself for the next sortie. There are no monuments, no sweeping histories, only a few reports stored in archives, a medal in a drawer, and a shift in doctrine that preserved lives for decades afterward. That is the inheritance of the quiet professionals, the engineers in uniform, the pilots who studied technical manuals and found answers where others saw only peril. They do not chase recognition. They pursue outcomes. And in the cold arithmetic of war, outcomes are the only memorial that endures. Knight's final notebook entry, written days before his last mission, read, "The measure of a man is not whether he felt fear, but whether fear prevented him from doing what was required." Fear is logical. Cowardice is yielding to it. Courage is refusing to let calculation become an excuse. He lived by that belief. He flew by it. And when the war was over, he put it down and returned to the ordinary task of building things meant to endure. But on a ridgeline in Italy, on a frozen February morning, one man showed that audacity and logic are not opposites, they are allies. And when joined with commitment, they can change the course of a battle, the doctrine of an air force, and the lives of men who never learned his name. That is enough.